statisticians use data taken from a sample of a population to make inferences about the members of the population they are trying to study. So the key words are sample and population. Population is what we're looking at. It's everything that you're looking at. It could be students, it could be dogs, it could be anything. And a sample is what you take of that to better understand the bigger population. And from this little sample, you are making inferences, conclusions, observations, things that you can deduce for the whole population. And down here is the basic breakdown of how stats kind of works. You identify an objective. You choose a sample of data, okay, and collect it. You organize it and do sample statistics, which we're going to learn that. And then you draw conclusions and inferences and see what you can learn from that. That represents the bigger population. Bias. You might see this in English classes, but bias in stats is an error that results in a misrepresentation of the members of the population. So if we make an error, that means that our sample will not represent the broader population. There is a bias going on that misrepresented that sample to the full population. So you don't want to have bias. You want to make your sample represent the population. And then on here, to reduce possibilities of bias in your sample is this keyword, random. If your sample is random, that's the huge, huge part. You want to choose your members of the population entirely by chance. You don't want to influence who are in your sample. You don't want to influence the sample at all. You just want the most random sample that depicts the broader population. There are three types of studies. You have a survey you can take, you can do an experiment, and you can do an observation. Those are three types of studies we're going to learn. We're going to be able to recognize or be able to think of how do you best take stats on the objective you want. There's a population and objective. To do that objective, to understand that population, there are different types of studies. Survey, pretty simple, take a survey. And you can read this and see it, but basically, take a survey, get some information. Got to choose really good questions we'll talk about later. Experiment, key thing on experiment is the experimental group and the control group. There are two different groups when you do an experiment. All right, the experimental group undergoes one single change, only one change, where the control group has no changes. So make sure you just change one thing so you see what the experiment, the one thing you want to know if it affects something, if that changes the control group. Don't make multiple changes. If you make multiple changes, you don't know which change caused the difference. So you make one single change in your experiment, and then you go and analyze how the two are different. If they're the same, then that means the experiment didn't change anything. And then the observational here at the bottom is just you observe. You're not influencing. If you read here, you're not involved in it. You're just kind of looking, seeing what happened. You didn't do a survey. You didn't kind of like, oh, here. You're kind of just, okay, here's some information. Let me look at it. Here's some people walking. Let me look at them. You're just kind of observing, but you're not involved in it. So those are the three basic ones you'll have to be aware of. All right, we want to know which each type of these are. The reason the first one's observational, because if you read this, you'll realize they're just doing an observation, not influencing, they're not surveying, they're not doing an experiment where we have a controlled group and an experimental group. So out of the options, observational makes the most sense. The next one here, as you read this one, what you realize it is a survey because you're doing Google questions. When you do Google, you're questioning, you're wondering, you're saying, what do you think? So that's a survey. And the last one is an experiment because you have a control group and an experimental group. You have two groups happening. One class you're kind of experimenting on and saying, does this work? Let's see. Now the question here is it a good experiment? Depending on how many things you're changing. If you change one thing, that's an experiment. But if you change too many things, not the best experiment. There's going to be some bias, some issues going on that doesn't depict the broader population. Survey questions that can create bias if they result in a response that does not accurately reflect the opinion of the participant. So bias creates an inaccurate opinion of the participant. You want to create questions that actually when the participant answers them, it's actually what they think and not confusing them and making them say something they don't actually agree with. So here's 4 ways that kind of create bias or confuse the person who's answering the question. For instance, if it's confusing or wordy, encouraging a certain response, like trying to get them to answer a certain way by maybe using adjectives or something that twist them in certain ways. Maybe causing strong reaction, like getting them emotionally involved or something in it. And addressing more than one issue. For a survey question, it should only do one issue at a time. So be very careful of those things.